Thank you very much for inviting me to speak here. It's a real honor to come share our work with you. At National Grid, we're a combined gas and electric utility that serves primarily Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and New York. When we think about resiliency, we think about resiliency in three prongs. We think about adapting our assets to make them more robust to weather. We think about changing our maintenance policies to make sure that those assets can better meet the weather. And the third prong, and that's the prong I'm here to talk to you about, is about better information. So can we use the data that we have to make better decisions in response to storms, and how can we use that to drive shorter restoration times? So that's what I'm here to talk to you about. So hopefully today I'll be able to answer these questions for you about why we're doing something like this, why we're working on predicting outages before they happen, who we did it with, what exactly it is that we did, and why it's valuable for us and for our customers. So Senator Pachenko asked that this be interactive. Absolutely, please stop me at any time. I have a tendency to go very technical. Please raise your hands and ask questions. So why did we do this? Why did we build a predictive model to help us predict outages before the storm arrives? Many reasons. The first and foremost, which everybody in this room is familiar with, we're facing a more volatile climate. And as utilities, we realize that we're more and more exposed to weather than we have been in the past. So we know that we need to make better decisions. Second reason is that this is a natural extension of the process work that we've been doing to make storm restoration process more efficient. Third, and most importantly, customer expectations have changed. You know, if we had asked people several decades ago about when they thought they would be reasonable to have their power restored, a week would have been fine. Now people measure that response time in terms of seconds and hours, not days or weeks. So we realize that that's changed. So the Mass DPU asked us to work with the local university to come up with a predictive model to help us understand the weather, its impact on our electrical system, and how we could use it to make better decisions in advance of a storm. So the first thing they teach you about building models is that you have to admit your own biases. So my bias is, when you ask me to work with a local university, is to work with my alma mater. So we have National Grid has been a sponsor of a program at MIT for about 4 years now. We reached out to MIT and engaged them to help us build this tool. Jorge is a chair of the program that we're in. It's the Leaders for Global Operations, which is a dual engineering and master's in business program. She also happens to be the co-chair of the Operations Research Department at MIT. And if you ask me, in my biased opinion, who in the world would you'd want to help you with this problem, it would be Jorge and her PhD students. So what is it that we built? When you build a model, you need to have a question that you're asking it. And for us, the central question is about storm response. For us, how many crews do we need to bring in to the area to respond to the storm? That is far and away the most important question we can ask in advance of a storm. There's an expression that goes, you don't build the church for Easter Sunday. Utilities do not staff for these type of events. We staff for normal day-to-day operations. We bring in crews from across the country beforehand to respond to storms, because otherwise no one would want to pay that utility bill if we staffed for emergency operations. So for us, the question we're asking is, how many crews do we need to bring in advance? And because we do have to marshal these resources from across the country, another way to ask the question is, can we predict in advance the likely level of damage that we're going to see from the forecast that we're getting, and from that derive the number of crews that we're going to need to meet the restoration times that our regulators and our customers deem appropriate. Our research tells us that our 3-day target is what we should be striving for. That's what sort of customers are willing to tolerate. So that's what we've plugged into the model, but the model can adjust to any number. So here what we do is we look at a lot of different data sets that are freely available or available internally. We look at information about our own electrical network. You know, where are our poles and our wires? Where are our transformers? How are they connected? How old are they? how were they constructed, all that information, and we overlay that on a map. We also overlay information about the environment around these assets because they tend to live outside where they're exposed to environment, especially trees. So we overlay that information on top of that, and then we look at the weather that was experienced by these assets in past events. And then we have a record of which assets failed during certain events. So from the first 4 data sets, we can look back in time and establish patterns statistically. Then we take a weather forecast and look prospectively in time and make a prediction using some advanced algorithms to estimate the level of the likely level of damage that we're going to see. And then from there, it's a pretty straightforward optimization exercise to say, well, this is the number of crews that you would need at these locations to respond in the time frame that you would like. So let's take a closer look at the different data sets that we're looking at. So this is a visualization of our electrical assets in Massachusetts. The bluer the square, the more assets we have in those squares. The model looks at each 2-mile by 2-mile grid as an independent climate. It doesn't carry over any assumptions. So the way that weather, assets, and environment interact on the coast, you'd expect to be very different than it would be in the mountainous regions. That's fine. The model doesn't take over any assumptions. It treats each 2-mile by 2-mile area as an independent climate. Why did we choose 2 miles by 2 miles? Really, it's trade-off in runtime in the model. The closer, the finer the granularity you put into the model, the longer it takes to run. At 2 miles by 2 miles, the model currently takes about 10 minutes to run, which we think is useful in that time period of 3 to 5 days before a storm hits to make a decision. If we start going any smaller, if we went to like 100 meters by 100 meters, the model tends to take about a week to run, which sort of loses its usefulness, right? The other thing I want to point out here is that we specifically left out transmission assets. We focused solely on distribution assets. Distribution assets are your bottleneck for determining restoration time. The other thing that allows us to do is to leave the firewall. There are certain federal laws about transmission assets that you have to apply a tighter security to them, which internally we've interpreted as meaning that they have to stay behind our firewall. This liberates me to do this type of analysis up on the cloud, where it's a whole lot cheaper. I talked to our IS department. They wanted $1 million just to have the conversation. I'm able to do this for $5 an hour up on Amazon. It's cost me 50 cents a run. So everybody agreed that that was a worthwhile decision. So we have our electrical assets. We know how they behave. We know how they're connected. The next thing we do is we look at the environmental information. Luckily for us, Massachusetts GIS has a pretty rich data set that we can glean a lot of valuable information, specifically land cover. So we grabbed all the land cover, tree cover information from this. You also look at altitude differences, slope differences, anything that you think would be useful in determining how those assets would interact with the weather and the environment. The next thing you need to understand is the weather that happened during those events. And one thing we quickly realized is that the National Weather Service stations are way too far apart to be useful for our type of analysis. So in Massachusetts, we were very fortunate to find a private network of companies called Earth Networks. You might have heard of them. If you have a mobile phone, if you've used WeatherBug, that's them. So it's a funny story. They started out about 20 years ago selling these sensors to high schools. So they would go and talk to the science teacher or the principal and say, hey, would you like to teach your students about meteorology and about science? We'll install a weather sensor on your roof and you can interact with it. Well, over the last 20 years, they've realized that the data that they've been collecting is actually much more valuable than that business of selling hardware to their students. So for us, the level of granularity we were able to establish with this network was on the order of 97% of our assets were less than 5 miles away for one of these sensors. So we have a pretty high degree of confidence that the weather that they recorded were what our assets experienced during these type of events. I want you to pay close attention to where there are no blue dots, because not surprisingly, that's where our model tends to struggle. I was at a conference at MIT, and Professor McAfee and Professor Bryantsov spoke about big data. And one of the quotes that really stuck with me was that every major revolution in understanding begins with the revolution in measurement. If we want to understand how weather and climate impact us, we have to do a better job of measuring it. There is no shortcut. The example they brought up was the microscope. They didn't invent the microscope. Our understanding of diseases stays the same as it was in the past, which was very primitive. We thought it was, imbalances in spirits and whatever else. It wasn't until they developed the microscope that we could understand that actually it was germs that caused disease. It's the same thing. If you want to understand weather and its impact, you have to do a better job of measuring it. This chart actually in New York is what causes me major fits. There are very, very few weather stations in New York, and I imagine across most of this country. The next thing you understand is the weather. Our input into the model is a weather forecast. We do not try to predict the weather. I leave that to much more qualified individuals. But our understanding of what is or is not included in the National Weather Service has changed with this project. I've come to understand that the National Weather Service's retail forecast is designed to inform consumers whether or not they need an umbrella that day. It is not designed to tell me whether or not I'm going to experience outages. A lot of the variables that we found to be very statistically important in determining outages are not being forecasted by the National Weather Service. So we'll talk about what we've done to address that gap. The other thing is that the National Weather Service tends to put their sensors at airports, and these tend to be much further apart. So Earth Networks was able to give me a 5-mile granularity. The National Weather Service in Massachusetts was giving me a 25-mile radius. So very, very different scale of information. Here's the outage data that we had to work with. This is a very small data set to try to find patterns. I've spoken to my counterparts down in Florida. They've tracked hurricanes for about a decade now. They've got about 50 storms to go off of, and they're also seeing the same event over and over again. It's all primarily wind-driven. In New England, we get the benefits of many different types of weather. We've seen ice storms, we've seen winter storms, we've seen hurricanes, tornadoes. We've seen a lot of it. So it's actually a harder problem to try to model here. I'm not going to bore you with the math, but what we're saying with the model is that we think that the outages that we're experiencing are somehow related to the type of asset that we have, the weather that was experienced, the environment around the asset, and where that interaction takes place, whether it's on the coast or a different part of the state. And you use different types of analysis to try to find those patterns, right? You expect this to not be a linear relationship. It's not like the wind blows 5% more and 5% more of your assets fall down. We know that's not the case. And if you're going to be making decisions on intuition, which is primarily how this industry has been making decisions, you better hope that it's a linear system, because intuition tends to do very poorly with nonlinear systems. So of the other utilities that have created something like this, they're either doing one or the other, a log-type regression or exponential regression because of that nonlinearity, which makes sense. Either your assets fail or they don't, and that would be captured by that type of relationship. If we had had more data, probably that technique would have sufficed, but we didn't. So the value that MIT played was that they were able to do more with less data and have actually applied a new methodology to this space. So we ended up modeling this as a Poisson process. What is that, right? If you and I sat at the intersection and counted the number of cars that went by for a year, we could use that formula right there to figure out what the probability of seeing a car go by in a given minute or a given hour. We have a distribution of past events that are related to the type of weather. Well, we could use that to figure out what those lambda values are to make a prediction about the weather. So that's what the model tries to do. For each 2-mile by 2-mile grid, it creates a matrix of values that describes how the weather, the asset type, and the land cover type have interacted to describe the rate at which you would expect events to be seen. Now, I love Excel, but this type of computing power far exceeds what you can do in Excel. So we actually built this with the Python programming language, and we put it up on the cloud. Like I said, it's taking about 10 minutes to run on the cloud, which is perfect. The cloud is really great for these type of applications. We're not running these every day. thankfully. We're running this, again, anywhere between 7 to 1 day before an event, or actually even during an event, we're running this model. So you're running this intermittently. But when you do run it, you need lots and lots of powerful computers to do it, and the cloud is perfect for that. Like I said, for $4.60 an hour, Amazon will gladly rent you those processors. The other thing we realized is that we had a very small data set that would grow over time, so we built this on an artificial intelligence platform. It's built on machine learning. The model will get smarter and smarter on its own. It retrains itself. It doesn't carry over any assumptions. It retrains itself every time it sees a new data point. It says, my understanding of how this type of asset and this type of weather interacts is different now that you've introduced this new data set. So we're excited about the long-term potential of this model. But I also want to highlight what it can do now. So the first question you're probably asking yourself is, how well does it do in picking up these type of relationships? And how you test that is you do an out-of-sample correlation. What does that mean is that you can't cheat and give it information about Sandy to predict Sandy, right? So you have to use the 5 prior events prior to Sandy to make a prediction about Sandy, and you repeat that process over again, right? So you train the model on 5 storms, not including itself, and then you see how well it is at predicting. And we see a mixed bag here. Where the model has seen multiple events, it actually does really well. So where it's seen many wind-driven events, you can see Sandy got about an 85% accuracy at a platform level. This is probably industry-leading performance with wind-driven events. Where it's only seen one ice event and we take that one ice event out, it tends to struggle. But as it sees more and more ice events, it will get smarter and it will adapt and it will find those patterns for us. We're confident of that. And I'm sorry, I mean to highlight that this is what, with actual weather, you don't want to hide the performance of your model with the noise of a forecast. So the first thing you do is you test it with actual weather. So we're playing a game here that is, God is our meteorologist and he's given us perfect weather information about the event. How well does it understand the relationship between weather, assets, and environment? And we're saying it actually does pretty well. This is Sandy in Massachusetts. So the blue dots is the number of actual outages that we experience at each platform. The yellow circle was what the model would have predicted before Sandy with actual weather. So do you remember where there were lots and lots of weather stations? Mm-hmm. The model nailed it. Where it struggled was where there was a lack of weather stations. This is not a surprise. Again, if you want to understand how weather impacts you, you have to measure it. So we overpredicted in the central parts of the state, and we underpredicted in the far western parts of the state. But where we had rich weather information, we did a really good job of predicting. Or I should say, we would have done a good job of predicting. This is a new model that we've developed. These are the weather variables and the predictive variables that help us predict outages. Wind gusts are important, precipitation rates are important, wind speeds are important, and pressure. Pressure is a great measurement of the power of a storm. So the lower that pressure is, the greater that pressure differential, the more power there is in a storm, the more outages you'd expect to see. The great thing about this model is that we didn't tell it what was important. It told us what it found to be important. So it validated a lot of our operational experience, what we've known to be important, but it did so statistically. We didn't bias it with this information. We were glad to see that what we thought was important was indeed important statistically. Also important is the type of construction they use and whether or not it's surrounded by trees. What was interesting to me was that asset age didn't seem to correlate, at least not yet, with what we've seen. It makes sense. It's whether you built it yesterday or 100 years from ago, during a storm, it's not the asset that fails. It's the tree surrounding the asset that fails, that tends to fall. So we like to say that God designed to a different standard than we did, with this in mind. That's not to say that there's not tons of other reasons to invest in more resilient assets. We are fully committed to doing that. We just haven't found a statistical correlation yet. So the reality is that we can't hire God as our meteorologist. We have to make do with what we have. And when you introduce a forecast, you're introducing 3 sources of error. You're introducing uncertainty. You're introducing, you lose granularity. We went from knowing the weather at 5 miles out to now knowing the weather at 25 miles out. And those things that we found to be important, only one of those is being forecasted. So we're missing some weather information. So let's see how that impacts our model. So the way to read this chart is to look at day 0 first. Day 0, you're still dealing with actual weather. So any difference in performance between what we had before and the forecast information at day 0 is not because of uncertainty. It's because of the missing granularity and the missing weather features. So you see across the board, we lost about 0.2 in our predictive power. We went from 0.64 on average to a 0.44. Sandy, which we were getting right at about an 85% rate, we're now down to 68%. To me, this is really good news because that's a problem that I can address with thousands of dollars. If the forecasts were inherently unstable and unuseful, that's a $1 billion problem. Luckily for us, we actually see that the forecast 5 days out is relatively stable. The loss in performance in the model because of the uncertainty in the forecast is small compared to what we lost in terms of granularity and missing weather features. So for us, that tells us that we just buy a custom forecast from Earth Networks or some other provider that can access our stations to get back that granularity and get back those missing weather features. And that's precisely what we've done. So we contracted with Earth Networks to get a forecast at each of their sensors. With that missing weather information, they've developed it for us. They have it up and running. They expect it to be tuned within the next couple of months. This is the difference in granularity that I was speaking about. So the blue dots are the Earth Networks weather sensors. The orange dots are your National Weather Service stations. So again, if we're serious about understanding the weather and its impact, we need to do a better job of measuring that information, especially in the areas that are underserved. And I'm exceptionally proud that when I've given this presentation to our executives, they're thinking, well, why don't we just add weather sensors? And that's precisely what we've done. So we are looking at donating a lot of weather sensors to schools, fire departments, police departments, and those geographies that are currently underserved by weather. We'll do that. We think that's pretty straightforward exercise in Massachusetts. Rhode Island, again, the same. Might add a couple weather sensors here. New York is a whole different ballgame. We've come to the same conclusion that the governor of New York came to in his post-Sandy address, that the weather system the infrastructure for measuring the weather needs to change. I know that he's committed about $18 million to do that in his state because more or less the same reason. You need to do a better job of measuring the weather. Again, these were the weather variables that our model found to be important that were missing from the forecast. We've got those all back from Earth Networks. Hopefully by now I've told you what's possible for a utility to do as far as being able to predict outages and then therefore make better decisions about how many resources to bring in before a major event. That's certainly a huge benefit, but one of the other benefits that we've seen is that pre-storm communication with customers such as your hospital systems that need to make those determinations about whether or not to evacuate. They want to see this type of information. Grocery stores need to decide whether or not they're going to bring in multi-million dollars worth of equipment to keep the refrigeration going. Otherwise, they'd have to throw away their produce. So actually, the more we interact with our customers, the more they realize that they would love to see this type of information beforehand. The other thing is that this model will, in the future, inform our decisions about where to harden the system. So as we see more and more events, we come to understand where we're most vulnerable, and we can therefore prioritize capital investments using this model. So we're in the process of expanding this to the other geographies. To Rhode Island, to New York, the model is very extensible. I could pick it up and move it to any part of the world as long as I had information about electrical assets, weather, and past outages and environment. I could run the model there. So that's all I had. Welcome any questions.